Hi, everybody. I'm Margie Meacham, and I am so excited to be with you today and to be part of the Professional Development Summit. The reason I'm so excited is because I believe so passionately in learning and in helping other people learn. And let me tell you how I first got interested in all of that. When I was a little girl, I just could not seem to learn how to read. I had the most terrible time with it, so much so that my teachers called my parents into the principal's office and sat them down and said, we need to hold her back because Margie is a little slow. And forgive me for using that word, but that's what they called it back then. And I was sitting right outside the door. And I can remember hearing my father screaming at the principal saying, that's not true. My little girl is not stupid. Whatever is going on, you need to help her. And so they worked out a deal that as long as I could read, by the time I came back from summer vacation, I could stay with my class. So my parents and the rest of my siblings, that was our project for the summer. As it turned out, it was actually one of my little sisters who figured out how to help me learn how to read. And I was caught up with my class, and I was able to continue. And it wasn't until I was in college where I was learning how to be a teacher that I took a course in learning disabilities and discovered that I'm dyslexic. And so, you can look that up, but basically my brain works a little differently, and it connects a little differently, and there's great things about that, and there's some challenges about that. But it turns out, now that we can study the brain, every one of us works a little differently. Your brain is more unique than a fingerprint. And I say more unique because two twins will have the same fingerprint, but they won't have the same brain. The wiring is completely unique to you. And the more you figure out how it works, the more successful you're going to be in life. And part of that is what I do as a learning consultant. I help people apply that science so they can help people learn better. Now, I know that all of you are learning professionals, so let's start by laying a little groundwork. Let's see how much you already know. Take a look at this little quiz and just decide for yourself what's true and what's false. And if you can jot it down, I hope you're taking notes because you learn better when you take notes. And just write down true or false for yourself somewhere as you go through these questions. I'll give you just a few more seconds. Okay, well, let's see how you did. Every one of these statements is false. And I know you might find at least a couple of those surprising, but we're going to go through them, and I will explain why. So in this session, you're going to learn why there's no such thing as a purely logical decision and how to keep your emotions from your lizard brain in balance with the more cognitive, logical parts of your brain. And we're going to talk about some skills to help you become intelligently emotional using the latest discoveries of neuroscience. So the 10% myth, which was the first question, here is a quote from a neuroscientist saying we use virtually every part of the brain, and most of the brain is active all the time. So now that we can actually watch it, these beautiful images that I'm showing, those are neurons, nerve cells in your brain, and they are communicating with each other through electrochemical energy. There's a light show going on in your brain. It creates these beautiful images that you've probably seen online. And what they're doing is cell to cell, they are communicating. That's how we create memories. That's how we define movement. That's how we tell our heart to keep pumping and our lungs to breathe. It keeps us alive. It keeps us thinking. It helps us process information. And that goes on even when we're asleep. And so we are always using our brains, every single bit of it. Now, where that myth came from is before we had a functional magnetic resonance imaging technology where we could look at these things, we could only study the brain after someone died. And scientists were able to figure out what about 10% of it did. And in a remarkable state of arrogance, they thought that meant we weren't using the rest of it. So it is a myth. We use it all. We need it all. And we're very glad we have it. So let's take a look at the statement that your brain is in your skull. Well, as you can see, it is sort of in your skull, but notice how connected it is. It goes from the brain through the spinal cord down to every part of your body. Your brain is in your fingertips. It's in your toes. It's in your neck. It's in your heart. It's everywhere that there's a nerve, because your brain is part of the nervous system. And this is really important when you think about things like muscle learning. So when you learn a physical task like riding a bike, you don't just learn it in the brain. You learn it in the muscles that are going to execute the action. A lot of your cognitive processes take place at a more subconscious level, including emotions. And so they are activating different parts of your body, as well as the brain itself. So your brain is everywhere in your body. And it's important to take care of your body to keep your brain functioning successfully. Now, another question on that quiz was left brain and right brain. And we all have these beautiful pictures where the left brain image is all science and math and analytics, and the right brain is all, emotions and activity and art and music. And people like to create patterns and make things simple. And the thing is, our brains are not simple. They are, in fact, the most complex object that human beings know. We have more cells in our brain than we have stars in the Milky Way. And we understand the Milky Way a lot better than we do our own brains. So it is only recently that we've come to discover that there is not a left and right brain separation, because the two halves are talking to each other constantly. And so those same signals I was talking about, they don't just sit there. If you're thinking about a math problem, you don't just sit there using the left side of your brain to solve that math problem. No, you're bouncing back and forth between all different parts of your brain to solve it. And as a matter of fact, at the highest level of achievement, the functioning of a musical genius looks a whole lot like the functioning of a mathematical genius, because it's the same. Math and music are underneath the same cognitive process. Music's highly mathematical. Math is highly creative at the highest level. So that might surprise some of you if you didn't like one or the other, or thought you weren't good at one or the other in school. But that's what the research shows. And it's because while you see a little separation between the two hemispheres, they are connected by the corpus callosum. It is a huge connection tangle of neurons. Think of it like a massive communication channel, and that's where that communication comes from. So all of us are left and right-brained. We may have told ourselves over and over that we're one or the other. Well, I'm not very good at math. I'm more creative, If you tell your brain something, it starts to behave as though that's true. So you want to be very careful about self-talk for yourself and your children and any children in your lives. But the truth is, we both have both those capabilities. And the more you nurture them, the more they work together, the more functioning your brain becomes. Now, another important thing, and the reason we're really here today, and what I'm going to spend most of my time on, is about emotional intelligence. And this is a copy of the groundbreaking book by Daniel Goleman, still a top bestseller, and it was simply called Emotional Intelligence. His work was groundbreaking and is still significant. He's a psychologist who has very recently started to apply neuroscience to his work because he's a smart guy. He realizes that now he can actually look at a brain, and he has a new version of this book out. And here's what he and other brain science people are saying, is that we know a lot more about the brain now, and we recognize things about emotion and reason that cannot be separated. Remember this image, we're all left and right brain, so it makes sense, doesn't it? You can't be purely logical or purely emotional. Both are always going on. It's kind of not a tug of war. It's not a battle. It's a balance. They work together. And so if you are trying in your job or your personal life to do something and be strictly logical, you're making a big mistake, because there's emotion there, whether you want to express it or not, whether you're even conscious of it or not, and suppressing it and ignoring it causes friction in the brain. It causes tension across these neurons because the message isn't being acted upon. And if those emotions are not expressed, your cognitive ability goes down. Now you don't make as good a decision. Your ability to be logical goes down if you fight your emotions. So every decision is a partnership between emotions, which I represent as the heart, and the brain to represent logic. And they're all taking place together inside your brain. So what are we going to do about that? Well, great leaders have always known this intuitively, and I just picked a few. I could have gone on and on. When you think about a great leader, they usually touched people emotionally as well as intellectually. And in fact, sometimes their emotional message is what lives on long after they're gone. So if we are developing ourselves as professionals and we want to become great leaders, we also need to recognize the power of the emotion. So here's what the science looks like. All of these parts of the brain are involved in three processes that work together: emotion, logic or cognition, and learning. Now, I don't expect you to remember all these pieces. I just want to show you how widespread, how much of your brain you use to do those three things: to feel emotions, to make decisions, and to think. So you have these different parts of your brain, the hippocampus, the amygdala. You've probably heard of. The amygdala, for example, is often connected with fear and anxiety in the fight or flight response, which results in a learning experience. So very strong emotions of fear and anxiety is what creates PTSD, but it might also teach you to remember the answer to a very particular problem because your teacher told you it's going to be on the test and it's 50% of your grade. Or it might remind you of a time when you had to make an important life-changing decision and you made either the right or the wrong one, and how you feel that won for you afterwards. The septal nuclei is one you may not have heard of, but that is your reward and pleasure response. Learning is supposed to be fun. We are hardwired to love it, to crave it. It is addictive. It is, in fact, the very same process that makes you love chocolate and sex. And sadly, some people's brains get a little bit miswired, and it becomes an addiction. But we are born addicted to learning. And that's a good thing. That's what keeps us alive. Because, you know, when you think about it, we're not the strongest or the fastest animal out there, but so far, we're the best at learning. Notice I didn't say smartest, but we are the best at adapting to our environment and learning how to fight or flight, how to stay alive. The cingulate cortex is where the code takes place that makes those memories more lasting. And the parahippocampus has kind of a side, we're still studying that. And I almost skipped the hippocampus, which has to do with mapping and spatial relationships. So you may have heard of the taxi drivers in London who have actually made this part of their brain, the hippocampus, physically larger because they spend so much time memorizing the streets of that complex city. Well, it turns out that it not only remembers those things, it remembers more metaphorical connections and relationships as well. So the hippocampus is a big deal when it comes to learning, and every one of these works together and has that emotional. Notice how many of these have, you know, there's the amygdala, which is hugely emotional. Septal nuclei, all about reward and pleasure. So this is where the brain brings in our emotions. So an important thing to remember, if you remember only one thing from this talk, and I hope you remember more, is that emotions are not distractions from learning and higher level thought. They are the key enablers that allow those things to happen. And so if we want to have intelligently emotional skills, we need to be able to recognize our emotions and work with them, because that's your brain telling you something. An emotion is a mental process just as much as solving a math problem. So how do we use these skills to develop ourselves, both as individuals and as leaders? Well, one thing is recognize the power of stories. I love this picture, how the storyteller is painting this beautiful, magical world, and you can just see it in the eyes of these children, the amazement that they have. Well, there's a lot of studies showing the power of stories, and we could do a whole hour just on that. The thing is, the reason they work is because we pay attention to other people. And so if you tell a story about someone else, in your brain, it looks like you are that other person. You experience a story at the same level with the same neurons, the same circuits as though it happened to you. And so that's why they become so emotionally charged. And there you go. Once you get that emotion connected with the learning, you'll remember the story because the pathways are much richer because of that emotional content. And so learning how to use a story to inspire and inform at the same time is a very important part of leadership. It's an important part of instructional design and training. And it's important for your own life so that when you want to learn something, you seek out stories that inspire you. And I would encourage you to be looking for stories in your world, in your professional development. Another part, and this has to do with those taxi drivers, trial and error is a wonderful way to learn because it lets you fail. And this is a picture of Steve Jobs, and this is one of his greatest quotes: failure can be the greatest thing in our lives. And like all great inventors, he went through many, many failures that didn't see the light of day or were introduced and didn't become great, successful products. We only remember the successes. Thomas Edison had something like 150 versions of the light bulb before he got one that worked. And he believed the same way. His statement was something to the effect that I didn't fail 150 times. I found 150 times how not to do it before I found the right one. But he considered every one of his failures a step along his journey. And that's how we should look at it too. Failure particularly creates a lot of negative emotions, particularly in today's workplace where you might be expected to be perfect. You might have even put that on yourself. You might think, to be successful, I can't fail. I need to analyze everything and plan it out to the last step and then drive myself to make it perfect. Well, all the studies show that all that does is narrow your focus, which means that you come up with a narrower solution. And while you might not fail as often, you also don't have a brilliant success. You're just kind of okay. Truly great performers open the world up for failure. They accept failure. They embrace it. They know that's where they're going to learn, and it's okay. And in organizations where it is okay to fail, people have a much higher rate of creative solutions. So it's okay to feel. When you feel that emotion, turn it around to a positive. Aha, I've learned something here. What have I learned? Another really important thing about these changes that I'm recommending is to understand what happens in your brain when you talk to yourself, that inner talk. Remember that when you tell a story, your brain thinks it's real. It can't tell the difference, and it sees itself, you, in that story, usually as the hero of the story. The other thing that happens is when you tell yourself things about yourself, what you can and can't do, the brain starts to wire itself down at the cellular level and possibly even at a molecular level. It operates the way your conscious thought or the thoughts of others tell you to operate. So in this beautiful picture, we are seeing signals passing between actual nerve cells under a very, very powerful electron microscope. And they're alive, and you can see the life. You can see the light passing between them and the little tendrils, the little connections. Just imagine if this message that's bouncing around in your head from cell to cell is, I can do it, I am capable, I am learning, or I'm not any good at that, I'm a failure, I've never done that very well. The difference is so powerful. Now, you still got to actually do some work. Thinking alone won't do it. And I want to make sure I'm very clear about that, because there's some pop culture stuff out there that would tell you, just believe it and it will happen. Just put it out there and the universe will find it. No, it's not quite that simple. We don't get off that easy. But it starts there. If you don't form the intent, you can't make it happen. Now, remember that little girl. There I was sitting, and I knew I wasn't doing well in school. I knew everybody else in class could read, and I couldn't. I was getting laughed at. The teacher was getting frustrated with me, maybe even a little angry. And I didn't understand what was going on. I was starting to think I was stupid. That moment when I heard my father stand up for me changed my life. And I am so lucky that I got to hear someone say that. Every day, we have those things happening to us. We need to be strong enough to choose to tell ourselves the positive if we happen to feel that emotion telling us differently, or somebody else tries to put that emotion on us. The power of intent, because it speaks directly to how your brain is going to function, is extremely important. Now, another thing that helps you learn is not just failure, it's also surprise, exploration. This is a picture of my baby puppy. She's a very inquisitive little girl. You can see, I love animals because you can see the wheels turn, can't you? You can just see her turning her head, trying to figure out, in this case it's my camera, what is Mommy doing? She's surprised. And she learned what that was, that it wasn't a threat, it was just some silly thing Mommy does, and now she doesn't pay it any attention. But she's surprised by other things. She's constantly surprised by her world. That's how we should be. When we were younger, we were like that. And at some time, we got the impression that growing up, meaning we stopped being surprised. That's not true. As a matter of fact, the more you're surprised, the more you're learning. And that feeling is a positive emotion. So look for ways to surprise yourself. Spend time with people who surprise you. You probably were surprised by a few things in my talk and in other people's talk. Make a note of those things. Explore them further on your own. I'm going to be providing you with some links and some further resources if you want to do some more reading on this and other subjects related to the brain and learning. So here's your 5 basic skills. Anytime you're in a stressful situation or a high-stakes situation where you know you need to make an important decision, ask yourself, how am I feeling? Don't try to stop the feeling. Just understand it. Embrace it. Recognize it. Start communicating, and if you're already doing it, do it more. Communicate key messages as stories, even to yourself. Tell yourself a story. If you learn something new, sit back for a minute and make a story about it and how it could be useful to you. Always give yourself the chance to fail, the forgiveness to fail, and recognize them as positive events on your journey to knowledge. Be intentional about the emotions you want to generate and select the excitement of learning. Choose to be a lifelong learner and choose to be engaged in your world. And if you do that, you're going to surprise yourself every day. Make it a goal. At the end of the day, ask yourself, what surprised me? If you can't think about anything, don't go to bed yet. There's got to be something out there to surprise you. If not, then you were kind of walking around in a fog all day. Every day is precious. Every day is a chance to be surprised, to form new neural connections, and to generate those emotional feelings that happen with learning. So, I said I like to think of it as a partnership. They're walking hand in hand, emotion and logic. Well, that's up to you, though, isn't it? It's a choice. It's an intent. Tell yourself right now that I know that emotions and logic work together, and I will never learn anything unless I bring those emotions along with me. Make it a part of who you are. Don't fight it. Now, at the end of the conference, after everyone's had an opportunity to watch all the speakers live or by recording, I'm going to give you a little gift. 2 people are going to get a signed copy of my book, Brain Matters, How to Help Anyone Learn Anything Using Neuroscience, and everyone is going to get an ebook called Teaching Future Leaders How to Think, Solving the Impending Leadership Crisis with Neuroscience. So these are my gifts because I'm so grateful to be here with you today, and I encourage you to stay in touch. Follow me on Twitter. Ask me questions there if you want, and check out my website where you can also sign up for our newsletter and see the latest articles on the brain and learning. And I'd like to take a moment to just let you know what a pleasure it's been to be here, and I have learned a lot from attending this conference, and I look forward to answering all your questions. So thank you, and let's go ahead and open it up for questions now.